After 30 years, is the Cold War heating up again? As tensions rise between Russia and Ukraine, NATO steps in to back Kiev. How will Moscow respond, and can diplomacy stop the escalation? I'm Andreas Umland, and today's newsmaker is the Russia-Ukraine confrontation. Troops are moving and threats are being dealt as ties between Russia and Ukraine deteriorate by the day. Kiev claims Moscow is preparing to invade as thousands of combat forces amass at the border. For almost a decade, Ukraine has been battling pro-Russian separatists in the east, and on Wednesday, in his annual address to Parliament, President Volodymyr Zelensky said it was time for direct talks with the Kremlin to end the conflict.
We must confess that without our troops, we will not be able to stop the war. We must tell the truth that we will not be able to stop the war without direct negotiations with Russia. And today, this has already been recognized by all external partners.
Now, the standoff between Moscow and Kiev has caused concern across the West. On Tuesday, foreign ministers from NATO met in Latvia to discuss how to respond should Russia launch a full-scale invasion. The military alliance is firmly backing Kiev, and Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg warned Moscow it would face serious consequences if it invades Ukraine.
There will be a high price to pay for Russia if they once again use force against the independent sovereign nation, Ukraine. We have demonstrated our ability to impose costs, economic, political actions, and also over the years also increased our military presence in this region, just to make sure that all allies are totally defended and protected against any Russian aggressive actions.
But President Putin rarely backs down from a fight, and in an equally, if not more aggressive response, he warned NATO against deploying troops or missiles to Ukraine, because if it does, a Russian retaliation would be on the cards.
We had an almost ideal relationship, especially in the mid-1990s. We were almost allies, but no, despite our warnings, despite our conversations, our requests, NATO infrastructures came close to our borders. It came to the point that anti-missile systems were deployed in Poland and Russia. If some kind of strike system appears on Ukrainian territory, the flight time to Moscow will be 7 to 10 minutes and 5 minutes in the case of a hypersonic weapon being deployed. But we have tested ours successfully. It will be in service at the start of next year. A new sea-based hypersonic Mach 9 capable missile. The flight time to those who give orders will be 5 minutes.
An invasion isn't the only thing Ukraine is worried about. Last week, President Zelensky said he'd foiled an attempt to forcibly remove him from power. And Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal claimed Russia was behind the attempted ouster.
We have secret data which demonstrate and shows special intentions to make something to enforce and make stronger this protests. And because of this, President announced this situation when outside forces or powers can influence on the internal political situation in Ukraine. Because of this...
You mean Russia?
Absolutely.
Following Russia's annexation of Crimea, support appeared to increase for Ukraine to join NATO. But some fear that if Kiev joins the alliance, Moscow will attack. Nevertheless, Ukraine is still calling on NATO for help, urging them to impose sanctions and boost military cooperation just in case the Kremlin does the unthinkable and invades. So what will it take to de-escalate tensions between Russia and Ukraine? And what role could NATO play? Well, to discuss that, I'm joined now from Moscow by Andrei Fedorov. He is Russia's former deputy foreign minister and a member of President Putin's advisory team. In London is Dana Lewis, a journalist and Russian affairs analyst. And in Kiev is Andreas Umland, An analyst at the Swedish Institute for International Affairs and a member of the Ukrainian Institute for the Future. Thanks all so much for being with us. How serious is this escalation right now? There are weapons standing ready, as well as those, in the planning phases, pointing at Russia and pointing at Europe. We've heard mention of an attempted coup. Dana, are we on the precipice?
Well, we're definitely on the precipice. But I don't think, Andrea, anybody can tell you right now what Russia's intentions are. And the very fact that they have this many troops, 100,000, 110,000, poised on the border with Ukraine, it looks threatening. The U.S. Secretary of State Blinken is warning Russia that there will be consequences. Ukraine is warning that they will fight back. There is a great fear of an invasion by Russia, and people are asking Russia to come clean, be more transparent, and tell us why are they massing that many troops on the border with Ukraine now.
Okay, Andrei, perhaps you can tell us what Russia's intentions actually are here. Why amass these troops on the border?
Okay, because frankly speaking, we are really on the possibility to appear on the edge of the conflict. There are clear situation from Russian side. We see that, in fact, Minsk peace process is dying. Pressure on Ukraine, from Ukraine on Donbass and Lugansk is growing. A number of the clashes on the borderline is increasing. And from our point of view, the concentration of near 120,000 Ukrainian troops, by the way, the most capable for fighting troops, is a danger for Lugansk and Donetsk, which is in fact is under Russia's protection. Let's not forget that in this area now nearly 650,000 people received Russian passports and are Russian citizens. So Putin is considering this as a legal ground to take any kind of action, including military action, to protect them.
Okay, so just to clarify, to what end Russia would launch an invasion of Ukraine? Is it to say that they feel an obligation to protect those hundreds of thousands of people who've taken Russian passports in the east of the country?
I can tell you with being sure 100% that Russia will not start invasion. The question is if Russia will make a strike back. Strike back is only possible in case if Ukrainian army will start at least limited offensive attack, for example, towards Donetsk, or, which is the most dangerous scenario, if Ukrainian troops will try to make a military operation, trying to cut off Donetsk and Lugansk from Russian border. In this case, Russian military interference in this last case will be inevitable.
Okay. Andreas, if I can ask you, I want to take a step back for a second because of what Andrei mentioned. Why is the Minsk peace process failing, or why has it failed?
Well, because there's no progress on the security side of the Minsk agreements from Russia. And Russia is a part of the Minsk process, is not fulfilling what has been agreed on, and that's why there's no progress. The political process in the occupied territories can only start once the Ukrainian state has again taken control of these territories. But currently there are still illegal armed formations on this territory, and that's why there is no progress in the negotiations. But there's also no fear there's no danger of a Ukrainian military solution of this. There was fighting in 2014, 2015, and then regular Russian troops entered in large numbers the Ukrainian territory, and that has been a bitter lesson for Ukraine. That's why these allegations that there is now a Ukrainian attack being planned are groundless. I think the reason for this is that Putin has domestic problems. and that he needs another victory, as there was in 2008 in Georgia and in 2014 when anti-Westernism and the popularity of Putin went up in the opinion polls, and now he seeks, against the background of the meager results of his party in the September 2021 parliamentary elections, another victory. That does not have to be a military victory, but he needs something like the acquisition of control of parts of Georgia in 2008 or of Crimea in 2014 to make Russians happy again, so to say. And that is, I think, the reason for this escalation.
Let me ask Dana about that. I mean, do you see this as part of Putin's kind of political PR strategy at this point? He needs a victory?
Well, I think that, you can examine what Russia has done in Ukraine, and it's a failed foreign policy effort, a miserable fail. They invaded Ukraine by taking the Crimea in 2014 and eastern Ukraine. They continue to supply the so-called rebels in that area with arms and ammunition. They have actually supplied fighting troops in that area, even though they deny it. And I think that they expected that Ukraine would collapse under the pressure of the last 7 years. But in fact, it has prospered to some degree with this agreement that it has with the European Union. The Ukrainian troops are standing very firm and very, very tall, and they are a decent fighting force. But look, Andrea, if I can say one thing, the Minsk Accords are not collapsing, but there is great disagreement between the two sides as to what the hell they are. And it's very important to understand that the Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 is interpreted by both sides to be something different. And here's what it boils down to. The Russians see the Minsk Accords, which was a ceasefire accords in 2014 and 2015, as a way to allow the Donbass region and Lugansk, all of that region, to have independence, to have some kind of federal sovereignty, and probably a veto. And that's what the Ukrainians fear, is that if they allow those elections to take place while there's fighting still going on, first of all, the fighting has to stop. That's part of the agreement. But if they allow it to take place, that then they will veto European Union membership. They would veto the future possibility, because it's still a very distant possibility, of NATO membership, and that they would even allow foreign entities to have the right to have a base there, including the Russians. So it's the Minsk conundrum, and it's a very serious gap between the two sides as to how they interpret that.
Okay. Andrei, I have to ask you, first of all, what Russians themselves actually think about what's happening. Andreas said it's been a miserable fail for Russia in Ukraine. But is that true? I mean, I've heard many Russians actually celebrate what's been done across Russia's borders. How is it perceived from there?
No, concerning Crimea, okay, yes, I can confirm that it was a national support for this step, etc., etc. Concerning Donbass, there are very mixed feelings in the Russian society. First of all, because many of Russians are considering situation with Donbass and Lugansk as a kind of banana skin, which will finally destroy everything in our relations with Europe and the United States. And at the same time, now 7 years passed since all the story started, and the other part of Russians are saying, okay, why we are waiting so long? Let's accept them as a part of Russia. Let's close this gap, which is existing now. Let's make them part of Russia, especially because, as I want to mention again, 1/3 of the population of Donbass and Lugansk republics have Russian passports. So from this point of view, this is just a question of time, what will happen. Because if there will be a military clash between Ukraine and Russia, it will speed up the process of inclusion of Donbass and Lugansk area into Russia.
I have to ask you, Andrei, as President Volodymyr Zelensky said, the next step has to be direct talks between Russia and Ukraine. Is there something preventing the two from talking? Or will that be next on the agenda to resolve this?
The problem is position of Putin, who is saying that he can meet Zelensky, he can speak with him, but only on the issue of Russian-Ukrainian relations, improving our relations. And from the other side, Zelensky team is insisting that cases of Crimea and Donbas, Lugansk should be included into this agenda, which is not unacceptable, which is not acceptable personally for Putin. That's why his position is still very clear: no talks.
Okay, Andreas Umland, you know, Russia says it wants guarantees that NATO will not expand further eastward. Is it fair for Moscow to dictate such conditions? Because it should be the choice, obviously, of sovereign nations. But then again, perhaps NATO could see Ukraine to be used as a compromise here.
Well, I think this is all a bogus argument about NATO. The Republic of Moldova has since 1994 a non-bloc status fixed in its constitution. However, for 30 years now, Russian troops are illegally on the territory of Moldova against the will of the Moldovan government. Ukraine has a NATO membership in its constitution as an aim, but it does not have a membership action plan. There are no plans for movement of troops, NATO troops to Ukraine. This is all a scarecrow that is basically designed for domestic purposes for the Russian population, to create the impression that there is an attack, a looming attack on Russia or on the occupied territories. And as I said, this has largely domestic reasons because the Russian leadership needed to falsify the September 2014 parliamentary elections to a very significant degree to get for the ruling party again a majority. And that's why it is now trying to repeat the success of 2008 or 2014, when the support for the regime, for Putin, was spiking, was going up because of new acquisitions of new territories. And apparently there's now a plan to get a similar victory.
Okay. Dana, let me ask you, what actually you think deters Russia? You know, NATO has told Russia to beware because of the costs of its actions, but has Russia really paid a price for its previous incursions in Ukraine? Sanctions have done very little. Talks have yielded less and less. I mean, what's really left to use as a tool?
Well, I think sanctions have had some effect, and that would be, you know, an argument for those who have imposed the sanctions. I think that here's what would really deter it. If Russia thinks it could just walk into Ukraine and, you know, shell the forward positions of the Ukrainian forces and then push beyond them, I think it's naive. I think that Ukrainians have shown now over, you know, 7, almost 8 years that they will fight and that they will absolutely resist. And Putin would be putting his forces in a quagmire there, further into a quagmire. They're already in the mud there. So I think that they would resist. And here's the great fear, Andrea, is that NATO would not intervene. And so, you know, Putin's idea that NATO is going to suddenly invade Russia or attack Russia, you know, we all know that that's not going to take place. And there is no immediate threat from NATO. But some of the NATO countries, like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, they'll definitely support Ukraine. And how will they support them? I think it's more than just, you know, restocking ammunition supplies. They may well enter into fighting. So here's a really catastrophic scenario where you have some NATO countries, not NATO itself making a collective decision, but some of them suddenly getting themselves into a conflict in Ukraine directly with Russian forces. And what if Russia turns around and takes out any kind of attack on those countries? Then you have a collective Article 5 situation in NATO. That's why this lack of trust, the increase in rhetoric, this cavernous dispute that is growing now in Ukraine as Russian forces mount on the border can very quickly spin out of control, and it's very serious.
It's a frightening perspective. I mean, Dana, though, just very quickly, do you think, as some have, assessed, that the whole issue with Belarus and the migrants massing on the border with Poland there in particular was actually constructed as a welcome distraction for Putin while this action was being taken on the border with Ukraine?
Putin has shown us over and over again that he wants to disrupt Europe. That was certainly the immigrant crisis, the migrant crisis, the refugee crisis between Belarus and Poland came right after he was meeting with Lukashenko. He is courting Belarus to reabsorb Belarus into the near abroad and back into Russia proper. So I think it is not my place to say whether the allegations are real or not, but Lithuania, Latvia, a lot of member states in Europe believe that Putin was behind.
Okay. Andrei, I'm going to turn to you. I just want to ask your reflection now on the assessments you just heard from both the other panelists.
I would like to mention one thing which Belarusian leader Lukashenko mentioned yesterday, that if there will be a military conflict between Russia and Ukraine, Belarus will be on the Russian side. This is also very important because in this case, it will be not bilateral military conflict, but it will be at least trilateral military conflict. So the biggest danger is that there are minimum 5-10 various triggers which can provocate the situation and can be a push for military clash.
Okay, Andrei, I'm going to stick with you for a minute because you said very clearly Putin doesn't want those direct talks with Ukraine right now. So could possibly more objective mediation, do you think, come from Turkey, as Turkey has suggested? It's a NATO member, but also one that's advocated against further use of sanctions against Russia.
No, the problem is only one. The problem is Crimea. Crimea is the point on which Ukraine won't like to talk with Putin. Putin says once and forever, no talks on Crimea. If Ukraine wants to speak with me on Crimea issue, there will be no talks. This is his position.
Okay.
And Turkey cannot change it.
Okay. Dana, do you think that's fair? I mean, or not fair necessarily, but just the reality.
I understand the two positions, but they've already met, over and over again after the annexation of Crimea. So the two sides go into those meetings saying, Crimea is mine, or Ukraine says it's not yours. It was annexed illegally. We want it back, and then they move on to the other issues. I mean, look, you have Russia dropped out of NATO now. You have Russia that is supposedly part of the OSCE disengagement patrols on the border between Russia and Ukraine, and they are working against those patrols and closing them off and hiding and turning cameras and interfering with what's supposed to be an international force, a disengagement force. Russia seems to be working at the end of this against all attempts to bring peace to that region.
Okay. Andreas, I need to ask you something further that we haven't brought up yet. And this is the role that potentially Germany in particular could play as a NATO member via the threats that are being issued now to potentially stop building the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That is of huge economic interest to Russia. But how serious is Germany and NATO about making and delivering on those kinds of threats?
Well, Nord Stream 2 has been built already. The question is now whether it will go operational.
Right.
There is a discussion about this in Germany. However, there are also lobby groups in Germany, political lobbying groups and economic lobbying groups who want this project to happen. However, the Ukrainians and other East Europeans are against this, as this is seen as a threat to Ukrainian sovereignty, because the experience has been that with the Nord Stream 1 pipeline that went operational in 2012, that this has decreased Russia's dependence from the Ukrainian gas transportation system, and this decrease in dependence has then led to, was one of the conditions, I think, for the annexation of Crimea and the covert intervention in the Donbas. And what now Ukraine and other East Europeans fear is that if Nord Stream 2 goes also online, all remaining dependence of Gazprom from the Ukrainian gas transportation system will end. And this will basically give Putin then a free hand. Currently, there's still some Russian gas going through Ukraine to the European Union through the Ukrainian gas transportation system. And these are geopolitical projects, both Nord Stream and 1 and Nord Stream 2 and also Turk Stream, that are not needed because there's a huge overcapacity already for transportation of gas. And that's why Nord Stream is a very contentious issue now. And perhaps the main actor here will be in the next year the US rather than Germany, because the US is now discussing sanctions against Nord Stream 2.
Right, and we're looking forward to the Blinken-Lavrov meeting that is apparently soon to happen. So unfortunately, we are completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. Really, I'd like to thank all my panelists for joining us. It's a fascinating discussion, and I'm sure we'll be discussing it further in the days and weeks to come. Thanks to our viewers as well for being with us as always. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter @_Newsmakers and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.